Amelia had always been captivated by mysteries hidden in quiet places, those whispers of old worlds that lay just beyond reach. As a young researcher specializing in folklore, she had heard countless tales of haunted woods and ancient curses, but none had fascinated her like the stories of the forgotten forest in Eastwood. According to local legend, the forest was a place where time twisted upon itself, a place where echoes of the past lingered like shadows. Some people claimed that those who entered never truly returned, while others whispered about voices that called from deep within, voices that hadn't been heard in generations. Amelia was determined to uncover the truth. She packed her journals, her audio recorder, and a flashlight, preparing herself for what she hoped would be a journey into the unknown. When she arrived in Eastwood, she felt a chill settle over her, a feeling as though the air itself was charged with a hidden energy, something almost alive and waiting. The town was small, nestled against the edge of the forest like a reluctant guardian. Cobblestone streets wound through rows of ancient cottages, each one bearing the marks of age and weather. People went about their business quietly, glancing toward the forest with wary eyes. Amelia felt a thrill of anticipation as she approached her rented cottage, located at the very edge of the forest. The cottage's owner, Mrs. Elspeth, was a thin, elderly woman with piercing blue eyes that held a glimmer of something Amelia couldn't quite place. Perhaps fear, perhaps wisdom. "So, you've come to investigate the forest, have you?" Mrs. Elspeth's voice was low and gravelly, but there was warmth in her tone. Amelia nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. "I'm studying local folklore, particularly the legends of this forest. They say it's haunted." Mrs. Elspeth's face darkened, and she glanced toward the forest. Haunted is a simple word for what lies within. The forgotten forest isn't like other places. It remembers things best left forgotten, things that don't belong in our world. Amelia's curiosity burned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Elspeth hesitated, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "People have heard voices, felt things watching them. Some say the forest draws them in, and when they come back, if they come back, they're changed. They're quieter, as if something of them stayed behind." Amelia thanked Mrs. Elspeth and settled into the cottage. But the old woman's words lingered, a quiet warning that hummed in her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the distant rustling of the trees, a sound that seemed almost like a whisper. The next morning, Amelia packed her equipment and set off into the forest. The early sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. She followed a narrow path that wound between towering oaks and twisted pines, their branches reaching out like fingers. The further she went, the thicker the trees became, forming an almost impenetrable wall that seemed to close in around her. An hour passed, then two, and Amelia realized she hadn't heard a single bird or seen any sign of animal life. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. The air felt thick, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Just as she was beginning to feel disoriented, she stumbled upon an old stone well. The stones were worn and covered in moss, but the well itself seemed oddly untouched by time. An inscription circled the edge, written in a language she didn't recognize. She took out her camera, snapping pictures, then leaned closer to inspect the carving. "To remember is to awaken the forgotten," she murmured, tracing the words with her finger. As she pulled her hand away, she felt a sudden chill, as though something had brushed against her. She looked around, but the forest was empty, silent. The wind had picked up, stirring the leaves into a soft murmur. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper. Her name, spoken so softly it could have been the wind. A shiver ran down her spine, and she stepped back from the well, trying to shake off the feeling. But the whispers continued, growing louder, until they seemed to fill the air around her. She backed away, heart pounding, and stumbled into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak, its trunk twisted and gnarled, with roots that stretched across the ground like fingers. There was something about the tree that felt ancient, as though it had been watching over the forest for centuries. Amelia approached cautiously, her footsteps soft on the mossy ground. As she neared the tree, she noticed something strange. Carved into the bark were dozens of names, some so faded they were barely visible, others fresh and sharp. Her own name was there, etched in clean, crisp letters. Her breath caught, and she took a step back, her mind racing. How could her name be there? She'd only arrived in Eastwood yesterday. She reached out to touch the carving, but as her fingers brushed the bark, she felt a jolt, like an electric shock. Images flashed before her eyes, faces she didn't recognize, places she'd never been. But they felt familiar, as though they were memories buried deep within her mind. She stumbled back, gasping for breath. The forest around her seemed to darken, the trees pressing in on all sides. She turned to leave, but the path was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Panic rose in her chest, and she began to run, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The whispers followed her, voices overlapping and mingling until they became a single, insistent sound. They grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She stumbled and fell, and as she lay on the ground, she felt the weight of the forest pressing down on her, a presence that was both vast and ancient. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. Amelia opened her eyes, blinking in the dim light. She was back at the edge of the forest, her hands clutching a handful of fallen leaves. She stood up, disoriented, and looked around. The village was just beyond the trees, quiet and unchanged. She made her way back to Mrs. Elspeth's cottage, her mind reeling. She didn't speak of what she had seen or heard, but she knew she would return. The forest had called to her, and she couldn't ignore its summons. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the whispers again, soft and distant, as though they were calling her back into the shadows. And she knew, deep down, that she would go.